Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, United States Marine Corps, retired, had run out of road. Divorced, estranged from his daughter, and living on the last of his disability pay, he bought an abandoned Cold War missile silo in the Montana High Plains for $900, expecting only a quiet place to disappear. But on the third day, his scarred war dog, Buster, froze and began to dig at a concrete floor deep underground. And behind it waited a secret, sealed for 20 years, that would drag Thorne back into a war he thought he'd left behind, and give him a reason to live again. The road to Lot 734 was less a road and more a memory of 1-2 ruts carved into the prairie that threatened to swallow the tires of his aging Ford Ranger. Elias Thorne drove slowly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Out here, the sky was everything. It was a vast, indifferent blue, pressing down on a landscape of dun-colored grass that bent sideways in a wind that never seemed to stop. It was the kind of emptiness he had been craving, a place so big it could absorb a man's history and leave no trace. His history felt heavy enough to sink a ship. Ramadi, 2006. The weight of the MRAP's armored door pressing down, the smell of burnt wiring and blood, the high, thin screaming that he only later realized was his own. That was the wound. Not just the shredded muscle in his left leg that ached with every drop in barometric pressure, but the other thing, the one that had methodically dismantled his life back home. It had cost him his wife, Sarah, who had tried for years to reach a man who was still scanning rooftops for snipers while sitting at the dinner table. It had cost him his daughter, Maya, who had eventually stopped trying to talk to a father whose answers were always monosyllabic and whose eyes were always somewhere else. He carried the guilt of that failure like a rucksack full of stones. In the passenger seat, Buster shifted his weight. The Belgian Malinois, his muzzle gone gray, was the only living thing that had been with him on both sides of that line. Buster had been his MWD, his partner. He'd dragged Thorne, unconscious and bleeding, from the wreckage of that MRAP, barking until the QRF found them. The dog had his own scars, a patch of slick, hairless skin on his flank from a shrapnel burn, a slight limp in his hind leg. Now he was Thorne's anchor. When the nightmares came, the dog would press his heavy head against Thorne's chest, a solid, living weight that pulled him back from the smoke and the noise. Thorne had bought the silo at a county tax auction, sight unseen. The listing was for 40 acres of worthless grazing land and something called a decommissioned subterranean structure. It was all he could afford. This was it. The last stop. He pulled the truck to a halt before a massive rust-streaked concrete slab that rose a few feet from the ground, the blast door of the silo. A smaller, equally grim concrete blockhouse stood nearby, its steel door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. This was home now, a tomb in the middle of nowhere. He got out, the wind snatching at his jacket, and looked at the desolation. It was perfect, a place to wait for the end, with no one to watch. Buster jumped down beside him, his tail giving a single tentative thump against Thorne's leg. He looked up at the man, then out at the endless grass, his posture alert, on duty. For the dog, the mission was never over. The mission was Thorne. And for the first time in a long time, Thorne felt a flicker of something that wasn't just tired resignation. It was the cold, familiar discipline of securing a new position. He had a perimeter to walk. The transaction had been as bleak as the property itself. He'd driven to the county seat, a town of a few hundred souls called Jericho Forks, and found the courthouse, a brick building that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. The county clerk was a woman named Carol, with tired eyes and hair pulled into a tight bun that seemed to hold all her patience in place. She took his $900 in cash, mostly 20s and 10s, without comment, counting it twice. "Lot 734, she said, her voice flat as she stamped a deed of sale. The old Atlas F site. She looked up at him then, her gaze taking in the military-style haircut that he'd kept for 30 years, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he stood at parade rest without thinking about it. You military? It wasn't a question. Marine Corps, Thorne said, just the facts. She nodded slowly, a flicker of something, pity, maybe recognition in her eyes. The last fella out there was Air Force, Abernathy, James Abernathy. She slid the stamped deed across the counter. He bought it about 25 years back, lived out there for a couple of years, then just vanished. Thorne took the papers. He didn't care about the history. He just wanted the key. People said he got strange, Carol continued, lowering her voice slightly, as if sharing a confidence he hadn't asked for. Talking about things nobody else saw. Trucks in the night. That sort of thing. Then one day his truck was gone, and so was he. Left everything else behind. Thorne folded the deed and put it in his pocket. Anything I need to know about the site? The well water's clean, last it was tested, but that was a long time ago, and the big door is welded shut. You'll have to use the personnel entrance in the blockhouse. She paused, chewing on her lip. Just be careful out there. Some places have a history, and sometimes people come looking for it. Her warning hung in the air, but Thorne dismissed it. He was done with people. He was looking for a place with no history, or at least none that involved him. He drove back out, the deed on the seat beside him. The blockhouse was a concrete cube, its steel door thick enough to stop a tank round. Inside, a spiral staircase of grated steel descended into the dark. He flicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through decades of dust. The air was cold, still, and smelled of damp concrete and rust. He and Buster went down, their steps echoing in the immense silence. The silo was a vertical concrete canyon connected by tunnels to a 2-story launch control center, a concrete bubble buried 50 feet down. It was a relic of a war that had been fought with threats and secrets, a place built to survive the end of the world. Thorne found the generator room. The old diesel generator was a monster, but it was dry and, against all odds, the fuel tank still held a few dozen gallons of sludgy but usable diesel. After 2 hours of work, cleaning fuel lines and checking contacts, he hit the ignition. The engine sputtered, caught, and then roared to life. The sound a violent intrusion into the tomb-like silence. Lights flickered on overhead, casting a pale, buzzing glow over the control consoles. The blast-proof chairs bolted to the floor. The whole strange, forgotten world. He felt a grim satisfaction. He had power. He had shelter. He had isolation. He had a fortress. He could last the winter here, and maybe the one after that. He could make this work. It wasn't a home, but it was a hole in the ground, and that was enough. The first 2 days were about routine. Thorne established a rhythm, a purpose. He cleared out the accumulated debris in the control center, swept the concrete floors, and checked the integrity of the seals and hatches. He was methodical, moving with the economy of motion he'd learned in the Corps. He was a man clearing a room, assessing threats, securing a position. The silo was a machine built for a single, terrible purpose, and though its brain had been removed, the bones were still good. The steel was solid, the concrete uncracked. It was a good place to hold, a good place to be left alone. Buster shadowed him everywhere, his claws clicking on the concrete. The dog seemed uneasy in the subterranean space, his ears twitching at the constant hum of the generator and the strange echoes that bounced off the curved walls. He'd often stop and lift his nose, sampling the dead air as if catching a scent from a ghost. Thorne would scratch him behind the ears. "It's just us now, bud," he'd murmur. "Nothing out here but the wind." On the 3rd day, the routine broke. They were down on the lower level of the launch control center, a space filled with banks of dead electronics and thick bundles of severed cables. Thorne was tracing a water pipe, checking for leaks, when Buster, who had been sniffing along the base of the far wall, suddenly went rigid. His body went taut, his head lowered, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. It was a sound Thorne knew well. It was the sound the dog made just before he located an explosive. It meant danger right here. "Easy, boy," Thorne said, straightening up. "What is it? A rat?" But Buster didn't move. His gaze was fixed on one specific spot on the floor, a seamless patch of concrete near the wall. He took a step forward, sniffed intently, and then began to paw at the floor, his claws scraping uselessly against the hard surface. He whined, a high, frustrated sound, then let out a sharp, commanding bark that cracked through the silence of the silo. "Hey, knock it off," Thorne commanded. Buster ignored him. He started digging in earnest now, scrabbling at the concrete, looking back at Thorne with an urgent intensity in his eyes. This was not about a rat. This was work. The dog was telling him something. Thorne walked over, his bad leg protesting the movement. He put his hand on Buster's neck, but the dog's muscles were coiled like springs. He wouldn't be moved. Thorne looked at the spot. It was identical to the rest of the floor, gray, dusty, solid. He stomped his boot on it. The sound was a dull thud. He stomped a few feet away, a slightly higher, more resonant thud. He went back to the original spot and stomped again. There it was, a subtle but definite difference. The sound was deader, as if there was something directly beneath the surface absorbing the impact. Not a hollow space, but a filled one. He knelt, running his hand over the concrete. It was smooth, no seams, no cracks. But Buster was now digging with a frantic energy, looking at Thorne as if to say, "Are you blind? It's right here." Thorne trusted the dog. He'd trusted him with his life in the middle of a war zone, and the dog had never been wrong. He stood up and looked around the room, his mind shifting from homeowner to operator. Something was wrong with this picture. Something was hidden here. And the only reason to hide something this deep underground, under solid concrete, was because it was valuable. Or it was dangerous. Or both. He went back up to his truck and retrieved a 12-pound sledgehammer and a long steel pry bar. The weight of the hammer felt good in his hands, solid and purposeful. When he returned, Buster was still at the spot, panting, his front paws dusty. The dog backed away as Thorne approached, sitting on his haunches, watching with sharp, intelligent eyes. He had done his job. Now it was the man's turn. Thorne swung the sledgehammer. The first blow sent a shockwave up his arms and resulted in little more than a white scar on the concrete. The sound was immense, a deafening crack that echoed up the silo shaft and back down again. He swung again and again, finding a rhythm, the same rhythm he used for chopping wood or driving fence posts. It was brutal, mindless work, and it felt good. Sweat slicked his back despite the underground chill. Chips of concrete flew. After 20 minutes, he had a small crater, and in the center of it, he saw the dull gleam of metal. He switched to the pry bar, working it into the cracks he'd made, levering up chunks of concrete. Beneath a 4-inch layer of reinforced concrete was a solid plate of 1/4-inch steel, its edges neatly welded to a steel frame set into the floor. This was no septic tank lid. This was deliberate, professional. Someone had wanted this sealed for good. He spent another hour with a cold chisel and the hammer, attacking the weld seam. The noise was piercing, a high-pitched shriek of metal on metal. Finally, he managed to break a corner of the weld. He jammed the tip of the pry bar into the gap and put his full weight on it. The steel plate groaned, bent, and then, with a final wrenching screech, popped free. He dragged the heavy plate aside and shone his flashlight into the opening. It revealed a small, metal-lined compartment, about 3 feet square and 2 feet deep. It was perfectly clean and dry. And it was not empty. Inside, neatly stacked, were 20 bundles of currency-strapped bearer bonds, their denominations in the thousands. Beside them were 5 small but heavy bars of gold, stamped with the mark of a Swiss refinery, and on top of it all was a thick, leather-bound journal, held closed with a leather strap. Thorne stared, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. This was a fortune, life-changing money, enough to fix everything, enough to buy a real house, maybe even find a way to reconnect with Maya. But as he reached for the journal, Carol's words came back to him. People come looking for it. This wasn't just a windfall. This was a secret. And secrets, he knew, always had owners. He lifted the journal out. The leather was worn but supple. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. Property of Captain James Abernathy, USAF, retired. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and you are in trouble. Thorne sat back on his heels, the cold of the concrete seeping into his jeans. Buster came over and nudged his hand, whining softly. Thorne began to read. Abernathy's story poured from the pages, a mirror of his own. A decorated pilot from the First Gulf War. He'd come home to a world that no longer made sense. He'd bought the silo for the same reason Thorne had, to disappear. He wrote about the peace of the prairie, the solitude. And then, the tone of the entries changed. He wrote about trucks he saw in the distance, running at night on the old service roads, their lights off. He wrote about finding strange markings near the other abandoned silo sites in the county. He began to investigate. What he'd found was a massive, illegal dumping operation. A powerful corporation, with local help, was using the network of forgotten missile sites to dispose of highly toxic chemical waste, burying it deep where no one would ever think to look. The money and the cash was what he'd been paid to look the other way. It was his proof and his insurance policy. The last entry was dated nearly 20 years ago. They know I know. Brody, the deputy then, came out today. Just a friendly chat. He's one of them. I've welded this shut. This is the only clean copy of my evidence. If you're reading this, they never stopped looking. Don't trust the water. And for God's sake, don't trust Sheriff Brody. Thorne closed the journal. The name hit him like a physical blow. Sheriff Brody. The friendly lawman who was supposed to protect the people of this county was part of it. He looked at the gold, the bonds. It wasn't treasure. It was a landmine. Abernathy had been silenced, and he had just dug up the reason why. For 3 days, Thorne did nothing. He resealed the compartment, placing the heavy steel plate back over the hole but not re-welding it, then covered it with a piece of plywood and some empty equipment racks. He tried to pretend he hadn't found it. He tried to convince himself he could just take the money and disappear for good, go somewhere warm, somewhere he could finally rest. But the words in the journal wouldn't leave him. If you are reading this, I am likely dead. It was a message from a ghost, another veteran who had found a war where he'd sought peace. To take the money and run would be to bury Abernathy a second time. On the 4th morning, he saw the plume of dust on the horizon, a single vehicle moving steadily up his track. Thorne watched from the blockhouse entrance, a pair of old binoculars to his eyes. It was a clean, late-model Ford F-250, a county vehicle. It pulled up, and a man in a crisp sheriff's uniform got out. He was tall, confident, with a politician's easy smile. Sheriff Brody. Buster, standing beside Thorne, let out a low growl that vibrated through the concrete floor. The dog didn't need to read a journal. He knew a threat when he saw one. "Morning," Brody called out, his voice friendly. "Just making the rounds, thought I'd stop and welcome the new neighbor." Thorne stepped out into the sunlight, keeping his hands loose at his sides. "Sheriff?" Brody's eyes scanned the area, taking in Thorne's truck, the generator's exhaust pipe, the heavy chain on the main gate. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an assessment. "Heard someone bought the old Abernathy place," Brody said, his smile never wavering. "Glad to see it. Hated to see it just sitting here. You plan on staying long?" "That's the plan." "Good, good. It's a quiet life out here." Brody took a few steps closer. "Say, Abernathy left a lot of junk behind when he took off. You haven't, happened to stumble across anything unusual, have you? Old military gear, anything like that?" The question was coded in casualness, but it landed with precision. He was fishing. Thorne kept his face a mask. "Just rust and dust, Sheriff." Brody nodded, though his eyes lingered on Thorne for a moment too long. "Yeah, figured as much. He was a troubled fella, Abernathy. Had some wild ideas. Well, if you need anything, you give me a call." He handed Thorne a business card. As Brody walked back to his truck, Thorne noticed the tires. They were spotless, caked with no mud, despite the half-mile of muddy ruts he'd just driven up. The truck hadn't come from the main road. It had been parked somewhere close by, on dry ground, watching. Brody had been observing him long before he'd driven up. The sheriff got in his truck, gave a final, friendly wave, and drove off. Thorne watched until the dust plume was gone. He was being watched. Brody, or whoever he worked for, knew someone new was in the silo, and they were wondering what he might find. That night, Thorne did a full perimeter check before settling in. He found it near the gate, half hidden in the grass, a freshly extinguished cigarette butt. Marlboro Lights. Thorne smoked hand-rolled drum. Someone had been standing there, in the dark, watching the blockhouse. The first intrusion hadn't been Brody's truck. It had been quieter, closer. The illusion of isolation was shattered. The vast, empty prairie no longer felt peaceful. It felt exposed. Thorne knew he was on hostile ground. He had two choices: run or fight. Run-in was the smart play. He had the money. He could be in Mexico in 2 days. But Abernathy's journal sat on the small table he'd set up, a silent testament to a man who had tried to do the right thing and had paid for it. Thorne had run from his own life for years. He wasn't sure he could run from this. He needed more information. He drove into Jericho Forks, not to the courthouse, but to the town's small, one-room library. The librarian was a woman in her late 60s, and she showed him how to use the microfiche machine. He spent hours scrolling through 20-year-old editions of the Jericho Forks Gazette. He found a few articles about James Abernathy. The narrative was consistent. A reclusive, unstable veteran suffering from war-related stress, who became a person of interest in his own disappearance. The implication being he'd simply walked away from his life. The articles quoted Sheriff Brody, then just a deputy, expressing sincere concern for the missing man's well-being. It was a neat, clean story. Too clean. Then he started searching for the name from the journal, Marcus Cole, and his company, High Plains Holdings. Cole was everywhere. Photos of him handing oversized checks to the high school band, sponsoring the county fair, donating a new wing to the tiny local clinic. He was the town's patriarch, a wealthy rancher and businessman whose logistics company was the largest employer in 3 counties. His trucks were everywhere on the local highways. Trucks that could run at night, without lights, and no one would ask a question. Thorne left the library and went to the only diner in town, a place called the Rusty Spoon. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee. The cook was an old man with flour on his apron and a face like a road map. His name tag read, Gus. Thorne nursed his coffee, listening to the low chatter of the local ranchers. He eventually asked Gus, "Did you know a fella named Abernathy? Lived out at the old missile site?" Gus's hand stilled for a second over the grill. He glanced at Thorne, then at the other customers. He wiped the counter with a damp cloth, moving closer. "Knew him," Gus said, his voice low. "He used to come in here. A good man, kept to himself, but he was sharp. Got real spooked toward the end, though." "Spooked how?" "Talking about Marcus Cole's trucks. Said they were running routes they had no business running, out by the old Atlas sites. Said something was poisoning the ground. He tried to tell people. Tried to tell Brody. Next thing you know, he's gone." Gus looked him straight in the eye. "Abernathy didn't just walk away. People like him don't leave their dog behind. He had an old retriever he loved more than anything. The dog just wasted away at the empty silo until someone from animal control came and got him." The detail hit Thorne harder than anything else. "You don't leave your dog." "Abernathy mentioned he had a sister," Thorne said. "You know how to find her?" Gus nodded slowly. "Helen Patterson. She's the head librarian over in Stillwater County, 2 hours west. She never believed the story they spun either." He leaned in even closer. "You be careful. Cole owns this town, and Brody is the dog he keeps on his porch." Thorne paid for his coffee and left. The net wasn't just tightening. It had been in place for 20 years. He was just the one who'd stumbled into it. When he got back to the silo, he knew immediately something was wrong. Buster was barking from inside the blockhouse, a frantic, aggressive sound. Thorne drew the .45 he now kept tucked in his waistband and approached cautiously. The heavy chain he'd put on the main gate had been cut with bolt cutters. The two ends were twisted back together, a crude refastening. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message. "We can get to you whenever we want." That night, sleep was impossible. Thorne sat in the dim light of the control center, his pistol on the table, Abernathy's journal open in front of him. Buster lay at his feet, head on his paws, but his body was tense, his ears swiveling at every groan of the old structure. The message at the gate was an escalation. The watching was over. The intimidation had begun. Thorne knew the next phase. They would try to discredit him, just as they had Abernathy. The troubled vet, a squatter, a transient. If that didn't work, they would remove him. He had to assume they knew he'd found the cache. They must have had their own ways of checking on the site over the years, and his arrival had triggered their alarm. They'd let him get settled, let him find it, and now they were coming to collect. He thought of Maya. If he disappeared out here, she'd never know what happened. She would just have one more piece of evidence that her father was a ghost, a man who had faded out of her life and then simply vanished. That thought, more than anything else, hardened his resolve. He wasn't Abernathy. He wasn't going to be a ghost story whispered in a diner. He spent the early morning hours preparing. He wasn't planning to start a fight, but he was damn well going to finish one if it came to him. He checked sightlines from the blockhouse, barricaded the secondary access hatch, and ran a tripwire connected to a handful of empty cans in the main tunnel. It was rudimentary, but it would make noise. He used his satellite phone, a piece of gear he kept for emergencies, and called the number Gus had given him for Helen Patterson. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was cautious, wary. He told her who he was and that he was at her brother's old property. "I read his journal," Thorne said simply. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then silence. "He's dead, isn't he?" she finally said, her voice thick with an old, carefully managed grief. "I think so," Thorne said. "But he left proof of what he found." He told her everything, about the waste dumping, about Cole and Brody. He told her about the money, and that he believed it was meant to be used to expose them. "I tried," she said, her voice breaking. "I went to the state police, the EPA. They all opened investigations that went nowhere. Marcus Cole has friends in high places. They buried it, and they buried my brother with it." Thorne knew that kind of fight, the one against a system designed to protect its own. "They know I'm here," he said. and I think they're coming." It was late afternoon when they came. 2 pickup trucks, not a sheriff's vehicle. They parked 100 yards from the gate and 4 men got out. They weren't soldiers. They were big, heavy-set locals, the kind of men who solved problems with their fists. They carried bolt cutters and heavy flashlights. This wasn't a professional team. This was crude local muscle sent to handle a squatter. One man cut the chain on the gate while the others fanned out. They were trying to be intimidating, but their movements were clumsy, loud. Thorne watched them from the blockhouse's narrow viewport. Buster stood beside him, a low, constant growl in his throat. The men approached the blockhouse, expecting to find him there. But Thorne wasn't there. He was deeper, in the silo's connecting tunnel, waiting in the dark. He heard the clatter of the cans as they tripped the wire. He heard them curse. He heard one of them say, "He's in the hole." Cole said to burn him out. Smoke began to drift down the stairwell. They'd started a fire in the blockhouse, probably with gasoline. A fire designed to either force him out into their arms or suffocate him in the tomb below. It was a stupid, brutal plan, and it was the last mistake they would make. Thorne retreated into the launch control center, the one place with heavy, sealable blast doors. As the men descended, blinded by their own smoke and the beams of their flashlights, he moved. He used the darkness, the echoes, the complex layout he now knew by heart. He was no longer a homeless veteran. He was Master Sergeant Thorne, and this was his field of fire. The fight was short and ugly. It wasn't about gunfire. It was about surprise and overwhelming force in tight quarters. He took the first man down with the steel pry bar, a disabling blow to the knee. The second he met coming around a corner, and a lifetime of close-quarters combat training took over. The third and fourth, hearing the sounds of the fight, came running, and he used their panic against them. He separated them and took them down one by one. But in the chaos, as the last man went down, he swung a heavy flashlight wildly, catching Buster on the side as the dog moved to protect Thorne. Buster yelped, a sharp cry of pain, and collapsed, his leg twisting under him. The rage that filled Thorne was cold and absolute. He subdued the last man, securing his hands with zip ties he'd prepared. The fire in the blockhouse was sputtering out, having failed to catch on the concrete and steel. He knelt beside Buster. The dog was breathing in shallow pants, his eyes glazed with pain. His front leg was broken. This was the cost. This was the point where the mission went from being about a dead man's honor to something deeply personal. He picked up one of the attacker's radios. He keyed the mic. "Brody," he said, his voice level and cold. "This is Thorne. Your boys failed." Silence on the other end. Then the sputtering, shocked voice of the sheriff. "Who is this? What's going on?" "I have your 4 friends here. They're a little banged up. You and I are going to have a talk. The Rusty Spoon Diner. 1 hour. You come alone. If I see anyone else..." Helen Patterson gets a package with a full confession from one of these men, and a copy of Abernathy's journal goes to the AP wire. He didn't wait for a reply. He smashed the radio on the concrete floor. Then he gently, carefully, lifted his wounded dog into his arms. The scene at the Rusty Spoon was tense enough to curdle the milk. Thorne walked in, carrying the still conscious but whimpering Buster in his arms. He had one of Cole's men in tow, a thick-necked bruiser with a broken nose, zip-tied and stumbling. Gus, the cook, saw him first. His eyes widened, and he reached for the phone behind the counter, but Thorne shook his head slightly. Gus understood. He put the phone down and just watched. The half-dozen locals having their evening coffee fell silent, their forks and cups frozen in midair. They stared at the bleeding man, at the injured dog, and at Thorne, whose face was a granite mask of cold fury. Thorne gently laid Buster on the vinyl of an empty booth, trying to keep his legs still. The dog licked his hand weakly. Then he shoved the captured man into the other side of the booth and sat down opposite him, placing Abernathy's journal on the table between them. He didn't have to wait long. Sheriff Brody's cruiser screamed to a halt outside. He came in alone, as instructed, but his hand was white-knuckled on the butt of his holstered pistol. His face was pale, his easy smile gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief and fear. "Thorne, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Brody hissed, trying to keep his voice low. "I'm finishing a conversation your boss started 20 years ago," Thorne said, his voice calm and clear enough for everyone in the diner to hear. He opened the journal. "This belongs to Captain James Abernathy. In it, he details how Marcus Cole's company, High Plains Holdings, has been using the old Atlas sites to illegally dump toxic waste. He also details how you, then a deputy, were on Cole's payroll to keep it quiet." Brody's face went from pale to sheet white. "That's insane. The ravings of a disturbed man. You're just like him, another broken-down soldier seeing conspiracies in the shadows." "Am I?" Thorne gestured to the man in the booth. "Then ask your employee here. Ask him who sent him and 3 others to my property tonight, to burn me out." All eyes in the diner turned to the captured man, who shrank under the collective gaze. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. "He's lying," Brody stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Gus stepped out from behind the counter, a heavy steel ladle in his hand. "I knew Jim Abernathy," Gus said, his voice a low growl. "And I know a liar when I see one, Brody. We all do." An old rancher in the corner booth stood up slowly. "My cattle have been sick for 5 years. Vets can't figure out why. My well water tastes like metal." Another woman chimed in. "My son has asthma so bad he can't play outside. The doctors in Stillwater said it's environmental." The dam of silence that Marcus Cole had built over 2 decades was cracking. The whispers, the suspicions, the unexplained sicknesses, it was all coming together right here, in the greasy air of a roadside diner. Brody was trapped. His authority was evaporating before his eyes. It was then that 2 cars pulled into the lot. Not locals. Dark sedans with government plates. 3 people in sober business suits got out. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes, walked in and surveyed the scene. "Sheriff Brody?" she said, her voice carrying an authority that superseded his entirely. "I'm Agent Miller, Environmental Protection Agency. We received a call from a Ms. Helen Patterson. I think you need to come with us. We have a warrant to search the properties of High Plains Holdings." The reckoning had arrived. Cole and Brody were arrested that night. The story exploded. Federal investigators, armed with Abernathy's detailed notes, found exactly what he said they would. Thousands of corroding barrels of industrial solvents and heavy metals buried just feet below the water table, poisoning the land for a generation. The national news descended on Jericho Forks, painting a story of corporate greed and small-town corruption. Thorne stayed out of it. His only concern was Buster. He used a few of the gold bars to pay for the best veterinary surgeon in the state to set the dog's leg. Months later, the silo was quiet again. The media had gone, the investigators were finishing their work, and a massive federal cleanup was underway. Thorne stood on the concrete cap of the silo, looking out at the prairie as the sun went down, painting the big sky in shades of orange and purple. Buster was beside him, his leg healed but for a permanent limp. He leaned against Thorne's good leg, a familiar grounding pressure. Thorne had used the rest of Abernathy's money to establish a foundation, the Abernathy Project. Its mission was to buy more of the abandoned, isolated properties like the silo and turn them into temporary, no-questions-asked retreats for veterans who, like him and Abernathy, just needed a place to be quiet for a while. It was a purpose. It was a way to honor the man who had left him a map. His satellite phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a text from Maya, Saw you on the news, Dad. I'm proud of you. Can we talk? He typed back a single word. Yes. He looked down at the old war dog, who looked back up at him, his tail giving a slow thump, thump, thump against Thorn's leg. He had come to this place to disappear, a man with nothing left to lose. But the loyalty of a good dog and the words of a dead man had shown him a different path. The hole in the ground he'd chosen for a grave had become the place where he finally, truly came home. Sometimes the truth doesn't want to stay buried. And sometimes the very thing that broke a man is what teaches him how to be whole again. The loyalty of a dog, the echo of a good man's last words, a second chance when you've run out of road. If you've got a story about loyalty that deep, share it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and let us know where you're watching from tonight.